We'll be introducing and we'll be talking about his work as an artist, a publisher, comics historian, man about town, raconteur, pin maker, collector, the many, many guises of Dennis Kitchen. My name is Rob Salkowitz. I am a writer and sayer of things about comics. I write for Forbes of all places because who better than Forbes to be talking to the underground comics guys? I also teach comics, among other things, at the University of Washington. I wrote a book on Comic-Con, and now I'm the guy who wrote a book about Comic-Con, so I get to do all this stuff. But my association with Dennis goes back longer than that. Dennis published my first printed work, which was a letter to the Spirit magazine in 1979 when I was 11 or 12 years old, and first put into my head the crazy idea that it's kind of nice to see your name in print. That led to another 40 years of aspiring to do that. So thank you, Dennis. It's always a pleasure to be talking to you about your awesome career.
Thank you, Rob. If my voice leaves midway, I'm in the early stage of laryngitis, but I'll do my best.
Talk into the mic, and so to make sure that the next person to pick up the mic inhales your laryngitis. Dennis's career lasts 50 years. We have 45 minutes, so we'll be taking the express lanes on this one. Why don't we start at the beginning and start with this sort of the secret origins of Kitchen Sink, because you had started out as an artist with no particular aspirations to be a publisher. How did that terrible event happen?
Yeah, I wanted to be a cartoonist, and timing is everything. In the late 60s, most of you know, there was a lot going on in America. The Vietnam War was making the headlines. I served 22 days in the U.S. Army. That's a different story. When I got out, my hair was quite short, but I was growing it back at this point, and I decided I was going to do a comic book and self-publish it, because how complicated could that be? And I quickly found out that I knew nothing about printing, distribution, or anything, and there was no one to help. It was literally the beginning of what became the underground comics movement. So I printed a few thousand copies, all I could afford, and astonishingly, I sold 3,000 copies on the east side of Milwaukee. So that tells you the law of supply and demand was such that hippies were hungry for their own kind of entertainment. And there wasn't anything. The underground papers were pretty strident, very heavily political. Whether you agreed with them or not, they weren't fun to read. Comics were something you could light up, read, laugh, maybe get an insight. And I quickly found out there was a community of us, and the guys in Chicago, the guys in San Francisco, mostly scattered all over, all doing the same thing. This picture is the Midwest underground cartoonists. That was me in the upper left when I had my Fu Manchu beard. And there was, those of you who were there, I don't have to explain it. Those of you who weren't there, there was a true sense of community. We were kindred spirits. We were all certainly opposed to the Vietnam War, especially those of us who were getting drafted. But there were other issues of the day that brought us together. Certainly we wanted to legalize pot, the women's movement, the gay movement, the civil rights movement was still ongoing. All these struggles were things that my generation was caught up in.
And before too long, your early success getting Moms printed and stuff like that led you to take on some other folks and sort of scale up the operations?
Yeah, I just wanted to be a cartoonist, but after I had that first successful stint at self-publishing, I briefly was involved with a Berkeley publisher, and in the simplest terms, I didn't like their accounting, which provided no information. And even as a very young artist, my feeling was I should be getting a statement. How many did you print? What's my percentage? I didn't get anything. And I thought, I don't trust these guys. I think I'll self-publish again because that was easy. And I told Jay Lynch and Skip Williamson, that's Jay there, who were the reigning Chicago underground cartoonists, Bijou fame. And Jay said, we don't like those guys either. If you're publishing your own, will you publish ours? And I said the dopiest thing I ever said, which was, sure, two's as easy as one, which makes no sense. But that day I became a publisher. And I had to learn the ropes quickly because the first thing I told myself was, I don't want to treat them like I was treated by the publisher on the West Coast. And I'm going to give honest accountings, frequent accountings. It's going to be very transparent. And I'm going to do the best production standards and things that basically are summarized by the golden rule. Treated them the way I expected to be treated. And as each month and year went by, I became less a cartoonist and more a publisher.
Now, of course, when we look back at the underground comics movement, the name that we all associate with it primarily is Robert Crumb, because his style at that time and to this day opened a lot of people's eyes about what you could do with comics. Nobody had ever seen stuff like that. Talk a little bit about how did you get involved with Crumb? What was the relationship between Kitchen Sink and Crumb stuff?
Crumb was close friends with Jay and Skip in Chicago, so I met him on his next trip to Chicago, and he came to my apartment where I had a 1940 Wurlitzer jukebox playing 78 RPM records. Robert, some of you may know, is a super serious, passionate collector of 78 RPM records, so it's kind of love at first sight right there. And so he just said, you want my next comic? I said, sure. So that was Homegrown Funnies, which ended up selling, I think, 140,000 copies. And it was all done on a handshake because we were hippies.
So about that last point, we tend to think of the underground comics movement as being sort of marginal and not part of the commercial comics industry and stuff like that. Just for context, today, a good selling, like a top selling diamond book in the direct market, like an issue of Batman, sells 100,000 copies. How many copies were you selling at the height of the movement through your distribution network?
I honestly don't know the answer to that, Rob, but they were numbers that would please most publishers today. It was what I call a rickety system in that it was a network of mostly head shops. But who went in the head shops? Guys and girls who were part of the counterculture, who were looking specifically for certain things. The essence of your existence. Rolling papers, bongs, and underground comics. And they all sold a ton. We were constantly reprinting every comic. Usually 10,000 at a time, run out, print 10,000 more. They were not monthlies like your newsstand comics. They were periodicals. If one was successful, the artist might do a second, might do a third, but mostly they were one-shots because we weren't thinking long-term. We were just living the moment.
And these were anthologies and very rarely had continuing characters and stuff like that. By the way, on the display, we're going to come to the PG-13 or worse section of the imagery here, leading off with my all-time favorite Dennis Kitchen cover. Because through all of this, you were doing the publishing, you were doing the business, but you were also doing your own artwork. So here we have.
Surely those of you who lived in New York at the time remember this moment.
He's gone on to invade the rest of the country now.
Yeah. That's Richard Corbin. Bizarre Sex was just a title that I just thought as a publisher, what would be weird enough and fun enough and commercial enough to just play with. And that was kind of an irresistible title. Dope Comics was another natural one. That's early Charles Burns before he went on to greater fame. Great introspective image. So these were anthologies, as Rob pointed out. Actually made a deal with the Grateful Dead to do their official comics. Got to spend a day with Jerry Garcia when he was sober.
You made a deal with a friend of the devil.
He told me what a huge fan of comics he was, starting with ECs and then Undergrounds. So that was fun.
So one of the interesting things, I mean, again, at the height of the underground movement, these books were selling, tens, hundreds of thousands. As Dennis says, numbers that would make a lot of today's publishers very happy. They were going through this network of head shops, and because of that, when the Nixon administration launched the war on drugs and started closing down a lot of these places, started cracking down on a lot of this stuff. This is something that interests me as sort of a business of comics guy. All of a sudden, this booming market kind of collapsed almost in a matter of months, right? It was pretty precipitous. How did Kitchen Sink survive that process? How did you manage to stay in business and sort of reinvent yourself as a slightly different kind of publisher in the mid-70s and beyond?
Well, in a very unexpected or unpredictable way, I became a pen pal with Stan Lee early on because I had been a fan of Marvel Comics when he reinvented them in the early 60s. I was passionately buying them at the time. And so during that pen pal relationship, he several times offered me a job, come to New York, work in the bullpen. And though I was a fan, I said, no, I got my own thing going. It's, I'm in control. Thanks, but no thanks. And then when the crash of 73 came, as we call it, I looked at my accounting with my partner, and he said, we're doomed. And I said, well, maybe I'll accept Stan's offer. So I went to New York, and we worked out a deal to do a magazine called Comics Book, Comics with an X. And I talked him into allowing us to own our own copyrights, to get our art back, which were never a policy at Marvel, and gave us pretty free rein, not a complete, but pretty free rein, and gave us newsstand distribution. So suddenly, this group of artists that had only been in head shops is on newsstands next to Mad Magazine and National Lampoon, and the rates were about 5 times higher than I could advance as an underground publisher. So, in a weird way, Stan, and that experiment only lasted a little over a year, but Stan indirectly saved Kitchen Sink Press, and a lot of underground cartoonists paid their rent during that rough spot.